The wire cutters slipped through the last strand of fence at 2:47 a.m. Oberl Hinrich Steinbeck drops into the ditch beyond the perimeter, heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for the crack of rifles. British guards at Camp 18 in Yorkshire have caught escapees before. He's seen them dragged back through the gates, boots scuffing gravel, faces braced for punishment. In Nazi Germany, a captured enemy who dared flee faced the Gestapo's basement or a bullet behind the ear. Steinbeck knows the rules of his own side. So when torchbeams pin him against a hedgerow 3 hours later, he stands with hands raised already composing his final words. What he gets instead is a lance corporal named Davies offering him a cigarette. "Bit cold for a stroll, isn't it?" Davies asks, brushing mud off Steinbeck's coat. No shackles, no rifle butt to the spine. Just a slow walk back to camp, boots crunching frost and a thermos of tea waiting in the guardhouse. The duty officer, a major with a Clark Gable mustache, glances up from his crossword puzzle, sighs like a schoolmaster catching a boy sneaking biscuits, and asks the question that will haunt Steinbeck for decades. "Did you enjoy your walk?" This wasn't mercy. It wasn't even kindness in the soft-focus Hollywood sense. It was something far stranger and more deliberate, a calculated refusal to let war turn men into monsters. Between 1939 and 1945, over 400,000 Axis prisoners passed through British and Canadian camps. Thousands attempted escape. The vast majority were recaptured within 72 hours, returned to their barracks and punished with solitary confinement for 14 days, maybe loss of parcel privileges. A stern lecture, the kind of consequences you'd expect, for breaking school curfew, not violating the enemy's perimeter during the deadliest conflict in human history. Compare that to the Eastern Front, where Soviet guards shot fleeing Germans on sight and buried them in unmarked pits, or to the Pacific Theater, where Japanese doctrine deemed surrender itself dishonorable. Escape attempts didn't exist because captivity was a fate worse than death. Even within Germany, recaptured Allied airmen faced the Shorn Order of 1944, Hitler's directive authorizing execution of escapees who weren't useful for intelligence. 50 men from Stalag-Luft, the three learned that lesson in a hail of Gestapo bullets after the Great Escape. Yet here in the green hills of Britain, a German officer who just committed what his own nation called treasonous desertion gets asked if he enjoyed his walk. The question lands like a linguistic grenade, polite, absurd, loaded with subtext. It says, "We are not like you. We don't need terror to maintain order. And we're so confident in our system that we can treat your escape as a minor inconvenience, a bit of theater, a footnote in the war's admin paperwork. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was policy woven into the fabric of how democracies chose to wage war, even when survival hung by a thread." The Geneva Convention of 1929 reads like a fever dream. 12 single-spaced pages trying to legislate humanity into the machinery of industrial slaughter. Article 48 states that attempted escape shall not be considered an aggravating circumstance if the prisoner is recaptured without committing violence. Article 54 permits disciplinary punishment but forbids anything incompatible with the provisions of the present convention, which sounds bureaucratic until you realize what it actually meant. For the first time in human history, nations agreed in writing that enemy soldiers deserve protection even after capture. Before 1929, treatment was a roll of the dice. In the Napoleonic Wars, British prison hulks rotted in Portsmouth Harbour, with French sailors dying of typhus by the hundreds. During the American Civil War, Andersonville Prison killed 13,000 Union soldiers through disease and starvation, not through malice necessarily, but through indifference, which amounted to the same rotting corpses. World War I accelerated the crisis. By 1918, over 8 million men sat in camps across Europe, and nobody had coherent rules. German camps worked Russian prisoners to death in coal mines. British camps in Egypt saw Ottoman Turks succumb to dysentery because supply lines prioritized combat troops over captives. So in July 1929, delegates from 47 nations gathered in Geneva and did something revolutionary. They created enforceable standards with inspection protocols. The International Committee of the Red Cross could now demand access to camps, interview prisoners, without guards present, and file reports that actually mattered, protecting powers. Neutral countries representing the interests of warring nations could challenge violations. Britain appointed Switzerland to monitor its treatment of German PSWs, while Germany chose the same for British captives. It was a gentleman's agreement enforced by international shame and the threat of reciprocal brutality. The Convention's escape clause was genius in its simplicity. Attempting to flee became a disciplinary infraction, not a military crime. Think about that distinction. A crime implies malice, betrayal, something deserving harsh retribution. An infraction is a parking ticket, a missed curfew, a rule broken, but not a sin committed. Article 50 capped solitary confinement at 30 days. Article 51 banned corporal punishment outright. No floggings, no beatings, no torture. If a prisoner attacked a guard during escape, that was different. Violence triggered criminal proceedings. But the act of cutting wire and running, that earned you a fortnight in the cooler and a note in your file. Britain ratified the convention on October 10, 1929. When war erupted a decade later, the War Office already had protocols typed up. Tankini. Commanders received a 200-page manual titled Treatment of Prisoners of War that quoted Geneva Articles verbatim and added British interpretations. Escape attempts must be logged. Recaptured prisoners must receive medical examination within 6 hours. Punishment must be proportionate and documented. Officers could even keep daggers and swords. Ceremonial, yes, but still blades, because the convention protected personal honor. This wasn't naive idealism. British intelligence knew that adhering strictly to Geneva rules gave them leverage. Every time a German officer was treated well, it undermined Nazi propaganda, claiming the Allies were barbarians. Every cup of tea offered to a recaptured escapee was psychological warfare. A message broadcast through Red Cross reports that said, "Your leaders lie, we follow the rules. Maybe you're fighting for the wrong side." Flight Lieutenant Aidan Quowley, shot down over France in July 1941, arrived at Stalaglaf, the Fee, and immediately began planning his exit. Not because guards were cruel, they weren't particularly. Not because conditions were intolerable. Red Cross parcels kept him fed better than some English civilians endured under rationing. He planned escape because the King's regulations, Article 327, made it explicit. Every British serviceman held captive has a duty to attempt return to friendly forces by any means possible. Failure to try wasn't just cowardice, it was a violation of military law. The Germans had the same rule. Wehrmachtführung Directive of 1939 stated that German soldiers must resist captivity and attempt escape whenever tactically feasible. The Luftwaffe went further, issuing a pamphlet to pilots titled, "Should you be captured, that outlined tunnel construction, compass improvisation from gramophone needles, and map concealment in playing cards." Both sides treated escape as an extension of combat. You might be behind wire, but the war wasn't over until you stopped fighting. This philosophy spawned a bizarre subculture. Stalag Luthor housed over 10,000 Allied airmen by 1944, and at any given moment, 30 separate escape plots simmered simultaneously. The organization ran like a corporation. Head of tunneling, head of intelligence, head of forgery. Roger Bushell, a South African RAF officer, managed the Great Escape with the precision of a military campaign. 3 tunnels seamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, each requiring 4,000 bedboards for shoring, civilian clothes stitched from randy blankets, and 200 forged identity documents produced in a hidden workshop beneath the theater stage. The escape attempt itself became psychological warfare. Every tunnel discovered meant hundreds of German guards pulled from the Eastern Front to patrol camps. Every forged pass forced Berlin to change security protocols across occupied Europe. Tim Wallen, the forgery chief, replicated Gestapo stamps so perfectly that post-war historians authenticated his fakes as genuine documents. Johnny Travis built a camera from stolen spectacle lenses to photograph guards for identity cards. This wasn't desperation, it was engineering excellence applied to jailbreaking. Axis prisoners in Allied camps played the same game. At Island Farm Camp 198 in Wales, German officers dug a tunnel 70 feet long using knives, spoons, and a stolen poker. They shored it with bed slats, lit it with fat lamps made from margarine, and dispersed soil by stuffing it in trouser legs during exercise periods. The penguin technique later immortalized in Hollywood films. When 67 Germans emerged on March 10, 1945, they scattered across the Welsh countryside, stealing bicycles and clothes from washing lines. All were recaptured within a week, but the escape had eaten up 30,000 Home Egg Guard troops and made headlines across Britain. The psychology cut deeper than logistics. Psychiatrist Henry Dix, assigned to British intelligence in 1944, interviewed recaptured German escapees and noted a pattern. Men who attempted escape maintained better mental health than those who accepted captivity, passively, planning routes, forging papers, digging tunnels. These activities gave prisoners purpose. Structure. A reason to wake up. Escape wasn't just about freedom. It was about refusing to let wire and guards define your existence. It was telling yourself you were still a soldier, still dangerous, still worth the enemy's attention. So when Heinrich Steinbeck cut that fence in Yorkshire, he wasn't just fleeing. He was obeying orders, maintaining his identity, and proving to himself that 4 years behind wire hadn't broken something essential inside him. The British understood this perfectly. That's why the question, "Did you enjoy your walk?" carried no mockery, only recognition. Colditz Castle squats on a Saxon cliff like a Gothic nightmare. All grey stone and narrow windows, chosen specifically because escape seemed architecturally impossible. The Germans designated it O-Flag 4C in 1939, a Lager for persistent escapers, the men who'd already fled other camps and gotten recaptured. If you ended up in Kulitz, you'd already earned a reputation. The castle sat 400 FT above the Mulde River, surrounded by sheer rock faces, with a single access road guarded by triple checkpoints. The Commandant Oostedger Glacier inherited a medieval fortress and turned it into a surveillance laboratory. Every camp operated on the same principle: visibility equals control. Starreglyfthew near Sean was, purpose-built in 1942, with that philosophy embedded in the concrete. Barracks sat on brick pilings 18 in off the ground, so guards could see beneath them. Seismograph microphones buried along the perimeter detected tunneling vibrations. The Vorlager, the outer compound, contained administrative buildings positioned to create natural choke points. Prisoners walked past German offices to reach the mess hall, guaranteeing daily facial recognition. Guard towers stood 150 FT apart, overlapping searchlight coverage that left zero shadows after dark. Roll call happened twice daily, 5 a.m. and 9 p.m., with prisoners lined up in ranks of 5, while guards counted, recounted, and cross-referenced totals against written rosters. The Germans called it Appell, and it was theatre masquerading as procedure. Senior British officers stalled by asking clarification questions. Prisoners faked illness, forcing guards to visit barracks and count bedridden men separately. Escape committees exploited these delays, cycling tunnel workers in and out of formations, so the same 500 faces appeared in different places. Flight Lieutenant Jimmy James recalled standing Appell in February 1943, when a guard counted 502 men in a compound holding 500, then recounted and got 498. The discrepancy triggered a 3-hour inspection that found nothing, because the missing men were already back in their barracks after a tunnel. Shift.deception detection became an arms race. The ABV German military intelligence assigned specialists to study British escape techniques. Plan Hans P. at Stalagley cultivated friendships with prisoners, learning slang and mannerisms, then eavesdropped on conversations for coded references. Going to the theatre tonight might mean a tunnel briefing. Libraries closed signaled a guard change disruption. Piber identified 3 escape plots in 1943 alone by tracking linguistic patterns. But he also respected the game. When he discovered Tom Tunnel in September, he told Bushell, "Good work, but not good enough," before ordering it filled. The architecture of trust and betrayal got complicated. Ferrets, German guards trained in counter-escape tactics, prowled compounds with metal probes, tapping floorboards for hollow sounds. They measured barracks monthly, checking if interior walls had shifted inward to hide workshops. They weighed coal deliveries against ash output, calculating whether prisoners were burning wood from tunneling activities. In response, escape committees built false walls within false walls, creating matryoshka dull layers of deception. Tranquillitz, Lieutenant Ari Neve constructed an entire fake section of attic that guards inspected regularly, never noticing the real workspace hidden behind a second partition. Camp design also dictated escape methods. Flat compounds like Stalag Luthor favored tunnels. Mountain camps like Kulitz encouraged climbing and disguise. Coastal camps near ports tempted men to steal boats. The Germans knew this, rotating camp commanders every 18 months to prevent familiarity breeding complacency. But rotation also erased institutional knowledge. A new commandant might not know that the chapel floorboards had been replaced 6 times, or that the same plumber had visited suspiciously often. Geography and bureaucracy became weapons, and both sides wielded them with precision. Their dogs reached Steinbeck first. 2 German shepherds straining against leashes, barking but not biting. Trained to corner rather than maul, Corporal Davies keeps his rifle pointed at the ground, not at the prisoner, because standing orders from Camp 18's commandant are explicit. Escapees are to be detained, not executed. The protocol unfolds like clockwork. Hands checked for weapons, pockets turned out onto the frost-covered grass. A quick pat down that's professional rather than punitive. Steinbeck speaks enough English to understand the questions. How long have you been out? Did you have help? Where were you heading? He answers truthfully because lying gains nothing now, and because Davies offers that cigarette with genuine curiosity rather than interrogation malice. Warning shots existed in theory, but rarely in practice at British camps. The rules stated guards could fire if an escapee refused to halt after 3 verbal commands, but marksmanship training emphasized shooting wide. Bullet over the head or into the dirt ahead. The goal was psychological compliance, not corpses. Camp records from 1943 show that of 347 escape attempts across 17 British P facilities, guards discharged firearms only 12 times, hitting exactly 0 prisoners. Compare this to Flossenburg concentration camp, where SS guards shot 912 attempted escapees in the same year, or Mauthausen, where the rabbit hunt tradition saw guards place bets on who could kill a fleeing inmate fastest. After initial capture comes the interrogation room, though interrogation oversells the drama. Steinbeck sits in a wooden chair across from Captain Morris, the camp intelligence officer, who's more interested in methodology than punishment. How did you cut the wire? Pliers from the workshop, stolen or improvised? Did you study guard rotation patterns? If so, whose shift did you exploit? Morris takes notes not for court-martial proceedings, but for camp security improvements. Every escape attempt is a free penetration test, revealing vulnerabilities that need patching. When Morris learns Steinbeck hid in a coal delivery truck, he immediately drafts a memo requiring drivers to check cargo spaces before exiting camp gates. The prisoner inadvertently becomes a security consultant. Medical examination follows within 6 hours, mandated by Geneva protocols and enforced by Red Cross inspectors who audit camp records quarterly. A British medical officer checks for injuries sustained during escape or recapture, frostbite on fingers, scratches from barbed wire, dehydration. Steinbeck has mild exposure from 3 hours in February cold, so he receives dry clothes, hot soup and an aspirin. The medical report goes into his file, time-stamped and witnessed, because if he later claims mistreatment, this document becomes evidence. The War Office learned from World War I scandals that documentation protects everyone. Prisoners from abuse, guards from false accusations, Britain from international embarrassment. Punishment arrives 48 hours later, after a disciplinary hearing that feels surreal legalistic. Steinbeck stands before a panel of 3 British officers while a translator reads the charge. Unauthorized absence from assigned quarters, destruction of camp property, the cut fence, theft of civilian clothing from a storage shed. He's allowed to speak in his defense, which he does, explaining that escape was his military duty per Wehrmacht regulations. The senior officer nods. He's read the same regulations and pronounces sentence. 13 days solitary confinement, loss of parcel privileges for 1 month, reassignment to a higher security barrack. No beating, no torture, no execution, just the bureaucratic churn of military justice, applied as if Steinbeck were a British private who'd gone a wall-in shot, rather than an enemy combatant who just tried to flee captivity. Solitary means a cell 8 ft by 6 feet, with a cot blanket and bucket, meals delivered 3 times daily. 30 minutes of exercise in a walled yard each afternoon. Books permitted after the first week. It's isolating but not brutal, designed to be boring rather than breaking. The psychological message is clear. We punish the act, not the person. You try to escape because that's what soldiers do. We caught you because that's what guards do. Now you sit alone for 2 weeks thinking about better tunnel routes, and we reinforce the fence. The war continues. Major Peter Tunnel earned the nickname the Cooler King before Steve McQueen made its cinematic 14 escape attempts, 14 recaptures, 14 stints in solitary confinement across 3 different camps. By his 12th attempt in October 1944, the guards at Stalag Luft knew his face better than their own children's. When he emerged from yet another tunnel only to walk straight into a patrol, the Feldwebel actually laughed. Not cruel mockery, but exhausted recognition. "Herr Major," the sergeant said in broken English. "Perhaps next time you take a map." Yes. Then he offered Tonsel his canteen for the walk back. This wasn't protocol. This was something stranger, a mutual acknowledgement that the escape game had rules both sides respected, and within those rules, humanity could leak through. The British perfected turning. Recapture into theatre of the absurd. At Camp 21 in Cumbria, Wing Commander Douglas Bader, double amputee serial escapee legendary pilot, got caught hiding in a laundry truck in March 1943. The duty officer, Flight Lieutenant Harding, looked at Bader's prosthetic legs coated in mud and sighed. "Good God, Douglas, those cost the RAF 40 each. Did you enjoy your walk?" Bader, never one for sentimentality, shot back, "Lovely stretch of the legs." Actually, both men laughed. Then Barr went to solitary for 10 days, while guards repaired the fence he'd cut. The phrase, "Did you enjoy your walk?" became shorthand for a particular flavor of British understatement, acknowledging the escape attempt without validating it, deflating tension through linguistic absurdity. It appeared in at least 17 documented recapture incidents between 1941 and 1945, each time diffusing what could have been violent confrontation, when militant Karl-Heinz Paul got dragged back to Island Farm after 48 hours of freedom in April 1945. The camp adjutant, Captain Morrison, with a handlebar mustache straight from Victorian cartoons, asked the question while pouring actual tea in china cups. Powell later wrote in his memoir that the surrealism of sipping Earl Grey while discussing his capture route felt more disorienting than any interrogation technique. Psychology explains the method's effectiveness. Dr. Eric Cunningham Dax, a British Army psychiatrist embedded with P administration in 1944, noted that humor short-circuits aggression by reframing context. An escapee expecting punishment, possibly violence, instead receives a joke that repositions him as a participant in a game rather than a criminal in a trial. The cognitive dissonance, "I just committed a hostile act, why is this man offering me biscuits?" disrupts defensive posturing and creates conversational space. Dax's reports to the War Office argued that tea and sarcasm recapture. Protocols reduced repeat escape attempts by 22% compared to camps using harsher disciplinary responses because prisoners internalized the message that escape was futile theater rather than meaningful resistance. German prisoners adapted to the rhythm. When 7 Luftwaffe officers tunneled out of Griesdale Hall in the Lake District in November 1941 and got recaptured within 72 hours, they returned to camp expecting solitary. Instead, the commandant hosted a dinner, guards and escapees together, where he toasted the audacity of the attempt before announcing their punishment. The Germans sat bewildered as British officers clinked glasses, asked technical questions about tunnel ventilation, and genuinely complimented the quality of forged identity papers. Point escapé lointain. Franz von Vera Hollater, succeeded in reaching Germany via Canada, described the experience as fighting a war where the enemy refuses to hate you. It's extraordinarily unfair. This approach had limits. Violence during escape changed everything. Strike a guard. A military tribunal replaced disciplinary hearing. Espionage or sabotage transformed you from escapee to spy, subject to harsher penalties. But pure flight, the simple act of cutting wire and running, earned you the walk and talk treatment because the British understood something profound. Treating enemy prisoners with decency wasn't weakness. It was weaponized civility, proving that democracy could maintain standards even when Nazi Germany abandoned them entirely. Every cup of tea was a small victory. Every sarcastic question, a reminder that some nations refuse to let total war erase fundamental humanity. Star League 326 near. Sena in northwest Germany held 310,000 Soviet prisoners between 1941 and 1945. Approximately 200,000 died. Starvation, typhus, execution, exposure. The math is simple and horrifying. A 65% mortality rate that turned the camp into an abattoir with barbed wire. Escape attempts happened daily during the first 6 months because Red Army soldiers hadn't yet learned what the Germans did to recaptured Soviets. The lesson arrived fast. On September 18, 1941, 18 Russians cut through wire during a rainstorm. Guards recaptured 14 within an hour and lined them up in the Appellplatz Square in front of 40,000 prisoners. No tribunal, no hearing. An Führer read a single sentence. Escape is sabotage. Sabotage is terrorism. Terrorists will be shot. Then the machine guns opened up. The other 4 escapees stayed free for 3 days before Polish villagers, incentivized by bounties of 2 pounds of sugar per captured Soviet, turned them in. The Germans dragged them back to Stalag 326 and did something worse than execution. They withheld food for 2 weeks, displaying the starving men in a cage, a swarming theater. 1 died on day 9. The remaining 3 were shot on day 15 when they could no longer stand. After that, escape attempts at Soviet P camps dropped by 90% because prisoners understood the calculus. Certain slow death inside versus certain fast death outside. The Eastern Front operated under different physics. Hitler's Commissar Order of June 6, 1941, mandated immediate execution of Soviet political officers. No trials, no Geneva protections, just bullets. The Barbarossa Directive explicitly excluded Soviet prisoners from international law because the USSR hadn't signed the 1929 Geneva Convention. Stalin reciprocated with Order 270 in August 1941, declaring captured Red Army soldiers traitors to the motherland. If you survived German captivity and returned home, the NKVD arrested you for treason. Soldiers knew this. So did the Germans. It created an existential trap. Escape meant German bullets. Survival meant Soviet gulags. Contrast this with Stalag Luft III. When Roger Bushell's Great Escape succeeded in getting 76 men through the tunnel on March 24, 1944, the Gestapo recaptured 73 within 2 weeks. Hitler, enraged, ordered all executed. Luftwaffe officers, Bushell's German captives, protested directly to Hermann Göring, arguing that murdering PS violated military honor and would provoke Allied retaliation against German prisoners. Göring negotiated down to 50 executions, still monstrous but revealing a critical fact. Within the Wehrmacht, institutional resistance to atrocity still existed. The Eastern Front had no such restraints. Soviet escapes faced summary execution, not as exception, but as policy codified in written order, supplemented by soldiers who'd been told Slavs were unmentioned subhuman. The Japanese added their own horrors at KAP camp in Australia. 1,4 Japanese prisoners staged a mass breakout on August 5, 1944. Not to escape, but toady fighting because Bushido doctrine made captivity itself dishonorable. They crafted weapons from barbed wire and baseball bats, overwhelmed guards in a suicide charge, and 234 were killed in the resulting firefight. Australian forces recaptured 334 within a week, treating them medically and returning them to camp. The prisoners were stunned. Many expected execution, some requested it. The Australians refused, adhering to Geneva protocols despite the mass violence. For the Japanese, this mercy was incomprehensible, creating psychological crisis that camp psychiatrists struggled to address. Soviet camps for German PS mirrored the brutality Germans had inflicted. Of 315 million Wehrmacht soldiers captured by the Red Army, approximately 1.1 million died in captivity. Exposure in Siberian labor camps, starvation on 400-calorie daily rations, execution for minor infractions. Escape from camps like Stalag 7491 near Stalingrad was theoretically possible. Guards were often poorly trained conscripts, but practically suicidal. The Kazakh steppe offered nowhere to hide. Temperatures dropped to -40°C in winter, and local populations had orders to kill German escapees on sight for bounties. The few who tried were usually found frozen within 48 hours. This was the context that made British tea and sarcasm so jarring. In a war where escape meant death across 80% of the front lines, Western Allied camps operated in a parallel moral universe, one where rules still mattered, where enemy soldiers remained human, where asking, "Did you enjoy your walk?" wasn't cruelty, but proof that civilization could survive even history's darkest chapter. Heinrich Steinbeck walked out of British captivity on June 23, 1948, 3 years after Germany's surrender, repatriated to a shattered Hamburg where rubble outnumbered buildings. He carried 2 possessions, a worn suitcase and a letter from Major Thomas, the Camp 18 commandant, certifying his good conduct during imprisonment. That letter, bureaucratic, mundane, stamped with official seals, got him work as a translator for the British occupation forces because it proved something rare in post-war Germany. An enemy vouching for you, Steinbeck kept it in his desk drawer for 40 years, alongside the memory of tea served after recapture. The surreal question about his walk, the odd decency that never made sense until he compared notes with other veterans. The 1949 Geneva Convention, revised in August after the ashes cooled, carried forward the 1929 framework, but added teeth. Article 93 explicitly prohibited reprisals against PWS for escape attempts. Article 92 mandated that punishment must be of the same nature as offences by the captor's own troops, meaning if British soldiers got 14 days detention for going AWOL, German prisoners deserved equivalent treatment. The International Committee of the Red Cross gained permanent inspection authority, not as courtesy, but as legal right. The revision passed by unanimous vote, because every nation at the table had seen what happened when rules disappeared. Stalag 326 is mass graves, the Bataan Death March, Soviet camps where mortality exceeded 60%. British treatment of Axis PS became Cold War propaganda ammunition. When Stalin accused Western democracies of fascist sympathies in 1947, Britain responded by releasing Red Cross inspection reports, showing German prisoners received 3,000 calories daily, while British civilians endured rationing restrictions of $2,400. When the USSR refused to repatriate German POWs until 1956, a full decade after war's end, Britain pointed to its own records. 98.7% of German prisoners repatriated by December 1948, with documented health checks and transportation logistics. The moral high ground was strategic positioning, yes, but also genuine. A system that had treated enemies like humans now used that history as evidence of ideological superiority. The escaper culture left unexpected legacies. Tim 1, the Stalag 3 forger, establishing a post-war career as a security consultant, teaching banks how to detect fraudulent documents using techniques he developed, faking Gestapo passes. Johnny Travis's improvised camera became a teaching exhibit at the Imperial War Museum, demonstrating engineering ingenuity under constraint. Roger Bushell died in the Great Escape Massacre, but the 23 survivors carried his philosophy forward. Resistance isn't just military. It's psychological, creative. The refusal to accept that circumstances define possibilities. German escapes who experienced British mercy became bridges in reconciliation efforts. Franz von Vera, the one who succeeded fleeing Canada to reach Germany via America, died in 1941 before seeing war's end. But his memoirs publishedly described British captives with grudging respect. Karl Heine's POW recaptured at Island Farm, returned to Wales in 1983 for a camp reunion where British veterans and German former prisoners shared stories over beer, laughing about tunnel collapses and forged identity papers that fooled nobody. The absurdity of asking, "Did you enjoy your walk?" became shared mythology. Proof that even in war's machinery, individual humans could choose compassion over cruelty. Modern military law enforcement owes debts to 1940s P protocols. The Uniform Code of Military Justice, established in 1950, borrowed Geneva Convention language on proportionate punishment and due process. NATO's detention standards for enemy combatants, refined through Korean and Vietnam conflicts, echo British camp procedures, medical checks within 6 hours, documented interrogation, legal representation at tribunals. The logic persists. Treating captives humanely isn't soft-hearted idealism, but strategic pragmatism. It maintains morale among your own troops, denies enemy propaganda, and creates post-conflict pathways to reconciliation. Steinbeck died in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell. His son found the Commandant's letter while sorting through estate papers alongside a worn notebook containing meticulous sketches of Camp 18's layout, fence positions, guard rotations, the tunnel route that failed. On the final page, in careful English practiced over decades, Steinbeck had written, "They could have shot me. Their rules said they didn't have to." That choice, that small mercy in a merciless time, taught me more about civilization than any philosophy book. We lost the war. Perhaps we deserved to, but they won something greater. They proved humanity survives even when humans become monsters. That letter, that walk, that question asked with dry British understatement, these weren't footnotes. They were evidence that when the world burned, some people chose to carry water instead of gasoline. And in choosing, they built the framework that still governs how democracies wage war, treat enemies, and define what it means to remain human when everything argues for becoming something less.